a man is accused of stabbing Dominique Lucas 33 times to death on a Las Vegas bus. Why did he do such a thing? Well, it would appear that this was a completely random attack on an innocent 30-year-old man. The footage shows the men sitting near each other when seemingly out of nowhere, they suddenly start to argue. Lucas can be heard telling his attacker that he wasn't bothering him just moments before Aaron Cole launches towards him with the knife, stabbing him several times. Lucas is then shown moving towards the front of the bus, pleading with the driver to open the doors. But rather controversially, the driver continues on his route, failing to help him escape this crazed murderer. And Aaron Cole isn't finished yet, as he then proceeds to stab Dominique Lucas a further 20 times, ultimately taking his life. But shockingly, Aaron Cole isn't even the first person to randomly stab somebody to death on a bus for no reason. As in 2008, a diagnosed schizophrenic, Vince Lee, took this one step further when he brutally stabbed, beheaded, and eventually cannibalized another man on a Canadian bus. On that fateful day, Vince attacked McLean while they were travelling on a Greyhound bus to Winnipeg. Witnesses reported that Vince began stabbing McLean in the chest and neck while he was sleeping with his headphones on. The driver pulled over and passengers were evacuated as Lee continued his gruesome attack, but the driver and 2 passengers did attempt to rescue McLean. Unfortunately, however, they were chased away by Vince, who slashed at them from behind the locked bus doors before returning to McLean's body. Surprisingly, on March 5th, 2009, a judge found Vince Lee not criminally responsible for McLean's killing, as Lee had apparently believed God had instructed him to do so and somehow thought he was acting in self-defense. Well, following his sentence, Lee was confined to the Selkirk Mental Health Centre in Manitoba to be treated for schizophrenia. After a year, he was granted the ability to take walks on hospital grounds, and in subsequent years, he was later given increased freedom, eventually leading to his release in 2017, just 8 years after the crime. Vince Lee was granted an absolute discharge with no restrictions under a new identity, and understandably, controversy erupted over the board's decision-making process and its secrecy around the case. But strangely, this incident isn't the first time a crazy Canadian has murdered someone in a bus-related attack, as just last month, a bus driver was charged with murder for deliberately crashing his bus into a Quebec daycare, killing 2 children and injuring 6 others. 51-year-old Pierre Saint-Amand reportedly stripped nude and began screaming after the incident, and was appropriately charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was also charged with attempted murder, 2 counts of aggravated assault, and 4 counts of assault with a weapon causing bodily harm. Witnesses reported that he appeared to be driving at a high speed when he hit the building, and then proceeded to exit the bus, remove his clothing, and scream incoherently. Several parents and bystanders tried to subdue him while rescuing children who were trapped under the bus, and the injured children were transported to St. Justine Hospital for treatment of serious injuries. But unlike some of the children who managed to survive this senseless attack, a schoolboy from the UK wasn't so lucky, as on March 14th of last year, Carlton Tanaway spotted Tyler Hurley waiting at a bus stop on Chadwell Heath High Road while he was travelling on the bus. Unbeknownst to Tyler, Carlton had concealed 2 large zombie knives under his clothing when he approached the boy. Tyler and his friends had recently uploaded a music video to YouTube that mocked some of Carlton's friends, and 2 weeks before the murder, Carlton's associates had actually attempted to retaliate, but on that occasion, Tyler managed to escape unharmed. But on this fateful day, when Carlton saw Tyler waiting at that bus stop, he instinctively jumped off as it stopped and fatally stabbed Tyler with the zombie knife multiple times, taking his life in the process. Carlton then pursued Tyler's friend, but a member of the public called the police to report him, and he fled. Officers eventually found Carlton hiding behind a wall in Burlington Gardens, and he was charged with murder on March the 16th, a fate which also met convicted murderer Darren Vickers. In 1997, 8-year-old Jamie Lavis was groomed and snatched after he boarded a bus in the UK. Shortly after Jamie went missing, in a sick attempt to stay close to the case, the bus driver inserted himself into the Lavis family home. He made public appeals for Jamie's safe return, appearing on TV to speak on the family's behalf. He even stayed with the family, sleeping in their bed, all the while monitoring the police investigation into Jamie's disappearance. But 2 years later, in 1999, Jamie's remains were finally discovered in Reddish Vale, and after further investigation, it was found that Darren Vickers was the culprit. Apparently, he had tricked Jamie into staying on his bus all day before sexually assaulting him, taking his life, and then hiding his body. Vickers was rightfully sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 25 years to serve. However, this date is quickly approaching, and worryingly, the parole board recently conducted a risk assessment and determined that Vickers could potentially be released. Personally, I'd argue that this man is a lost cause and will never be a functional member of society, no matter how long he is imprisoned. An opinion I share for a very similar case which occurred in Malaysia, where a girl's lifeless body was thrown out of a moving bus on the busy streets of Malaysia's capital. She too was sexually assaulted, and the details of this case are truly haunting. 23 years ago, a normal bus journey to work turned into a real living nightmare that took the life of Nur Sizali Mukhtar, a 24-year-old girl from Malaysia. She had recently returned home after graduating from De Montfort University in the UK, and on the morning of October 7th, Nur was travelling to her job at a private medical centre in Port Klang, where she worked as a computer engineer. That day, she boarded an intercity bus, but little did she know, this would be the last bus ride of her life. A few stops before her final destination, most of the passengers had already departed from the bus, all except for Nur. It was now just her and the bus driver. Unfortunately, Nur never arrived at work that day, as the bus was diverted and she was taken to a different location. One of the witnesses was a man named Devon, an 18-year-old student cycling to a tuition centre. He claimed to have seen a stationary bus on the side of the road and suspected that something was amiss. Devon further examined the scene, and this was when he noticed a topless woman inside the bus, frantically slamming her hands on the tinted window of the passenger door. Once the bus driver detected Devon, he examined the situation and simply shooed him away. After relentlessly chasing after the bus on his bike, Devon then witnessed the bus driver, later identified as Hanafi, dump Nur's lifeless body out of the moving vehicle next to a construction site. The body was then taken to the closest hospital, where a post-mortem revealed that the woman was brutally assaulted. Hanafi had stripped Nur Sizali, tied her hands with her headscarf, and then decided to rape and sodomize her. After he was finished, Hanafi then used the same scarf to strangle her, and the report showed that the deceased had suffered a staggering 44 injuries to the body, including a broken neck. Hanafi was eventually caught and convicted of murder, but that doesn't quite make this story any easier to digest. A Colorado dentist was arrested over the murder of his wife by lacing her protein shake with cyanide, leaving their 6 children without a mother. Why would he do such a thing? So he could start a new life with another woman. This is the toxic case of James Craig, the deadly dentist. Now, everybody hates the dentist. There aren't too many experiences in life that compare to the vulnerability that comes with having a person's hands inside your mouth, rummaging around with sharp metal tools. It's an experience we almost always dread, but on rare occasions, having a good dentist can sometimes be the difference. Well, for several people in Colorado last week, they likely would have been relieved to discover that their dental appointment was abruptly cancelled, but I'm sure the relief they initially felt soon turned to shock, as the face of their local dentist was now plastered all over the news. as a murderer. 45-year-old dentist James Tolliver Craig has now been officially charged with the murder of his 43-year-old wife, Angela Craig, a loving mother of 6. New evidence has recently come to light which shows James had searched online for poisons that could kill a person without detection, and even ordered a canister of toxic potassium cyanide just 2 days before his wife mysteriously died. According to the arrest warrant, James Craig intended to start a new life with his alleged lover, whose name is yet to be identified. The late Angela Craig was taken to the hospital after complaining of dizziness and headaches, but her condition quickly deteriorated as she was placed on a ventilator. Unfortunately, just 2 days later, she was declared brain dead and taken off life support on Sunday, the 19th of March. Investigators claim that James had been exchanging sexually explicit emails to his mistress in Denver, while his wife was dying in the hospital. To make matters worse, this certainly wasn't the first time Angela had visited the hospital under similar circumstances. In a series of emails viewed by investigators, the alleged murderer had actually made travel plans for his mistress to visit him on dates that lined up almost precisely with Angela's various hospital visits. This means that while James Craig's wife was lying there in critical condition, fighting for her life, he was busy organising meetups with his mistress. On Monday morning, Craig was arrested and charged with his wife's murder. The arrest affidavit points towards several motives for the murder, including infidelity, financial problems, and a past incident in which James quite literally poisoned Angela on an earlier occasion. In early March, when Angela began to exhibit symptoms and first went to the hospital, she actually told her husband by text that she quote-unquote felt drugged. Police believed at this time she had been poisoned with arsenic by her very own husband. The affidavit further claims that the dentist had used the computer at his office to search how much arsenic is needed to kill a person, and placed orders for arsenic, cyanide, and oleandrin, 3 deadly chemicals which can certainly be used for murder. His disturbing web searches also included how many grams of pure arsenic will kill a human, and is arsenic detectable in an autopsy. He was also found to have accessed an article titled 6 Deadly Undetectable Poisons, and coincidentally, soon after, a shipment of arsenic was delivered to Craig's house on March 4th. With doctors initially unable to figure out what was wrong with Angela Craig, police began investigating her husband after his dental practice partner, Ryan Redfern, told a nurse about his recent orders. According to Ryan, these chemicals were not required at the time, and so James had no legitimate reason to be placing this order. Investigators believe that on March 6th, James put arsenic in his wife's protein shake, which he routinely made for their workouts. But after she survived the poisoning, James then ordered a rush shipment of potassium cyanide that he told the supplier was needed for an urgent surgery. Although James had asked an office manager not to open the package of cyanide, luckily another employee did, which is how they were able to identify the strange order. And to add yet another strong piece of evidence into the mix, during the investigation, authorities managed to intercept a delivery of oleandrin, which James Craig is also accused of ordering. Oleandrin is a poisonous substance and was likely purchased to be the final nail in the coffin for his dying wife, Angela. Rather surprisingly, poisoning is actually quite a rare method of homicide, with data suggesting that it is used in less than 1% of all murder cases. The reason for this is that with modern forensic techniques, we are now able to identify virtually any toxic agents in a corpse, even if they are present only in minuscule amounts. So with this in mind, it would appear choosing to poison somebody is not just an incredibly evil thing to do, but for somebody who wants to evade conviction, it's just plain stupid. Also, after the investigation had kicked into high gear, James Craig genuinely tried to convince an associate that Angela had asked him to order the cyanide for her because she was apparently suicidal and lacked the proper credentials to obtain it herself. Craig reportedly always had a troubled marriage with Angela, having multiple affairs over the years with several different women. He was also addicted to pornography since he was a teenager, which had been an ongoing battle throughout the marriage. In fact, the marital issues had gotten so bad that James Craig had previously told a social worker that his wife had been depressed ever since he supposedly asked for a divorce back in December of last year. But to contrast this, Angela's sister seemed to claim the complete opposite, as she confided to the police that James was in fact the depressed one in the marriage. And due to being on the verge of bankruptcy for a second time, Angela had expressed concern that he was planning to commit suicide with a lethal injection. The arrest of James Craig has left Angela's family grappling with a lot of grief and a lot of anger. Craig had ran the Summer Brook Dental Group practice before his arrest, and the group actually filed for bankruptcy protection in 2020 and had applied at the beginning of March close to this case. The office's website was deactivated on Monday, but an archived 2021 press release said that he and Angela Craig were happily married and had 6 children together. A client of Craig's was quoted as saying that their first thought was really of the couple's kids. "I just can't imagine children being without a mother and potentially even without their father." Craig made his first appearance in court on Monday when he was held without bond and prohibited from contacting his children, 3 of whom are younger than 18. Well, the evidence is certainly stacked up against James Craig, and I can't personally see any way that he is not guilty here. But as of right now, all of the information I've provided is pretty much everything that has been released to the public. The likely reason being that according to court records, James Craig is being represented by the Public Defender's Office, which does not comment on cases. However, it is speculated that James will face life imprisonment if he is eventually convicted of first-degree murder. Police have accused a woman named Lindsay Clancy, a 32-year-old nurse from Massachusetts, of strangling her 3 young children to death just last month. After her husband Patrick left to pick up their dinner, Lindsay tied exercise bands around her kids' throats, with enough pressure to eventually take their lives. She then cowardly jumped out of a second-story window to rid herself of the guilt. Doctors immediately pronounced that all 3 children were dead. However, Lindsay somehow survived the fall, and is now left with the reality of what she has done. Now, it is important to understand that this was not a woman of sound mind. She had been suffering with postpartum depression and was heavily medicated at the time, which many believe is the sole cause of this tragic incident. Nevertheless, although Clancy is one of the most recent cases of a mother taking the lives of her own children, she is certainly not the first, as Megan Huntsman pleaded guilty in 2015 to suffocating 6 of her own babies right after giving birth to them from 1996 to 2006 in Pleasant Grove, Utah. She put their bodies into plastic bags, placed them in boxes, and stored them in her garage, where her husband unfortunately found them in 2014. Her family said that she had a history of drug and alcohol abuse, but this certainly isn't an excuse in my opinion. Before receiving a life sentence, she said in a statement to the court, She didn't feel strong enough to be a mother to these tiny babies, and in some small way she wanted to avoid the terrible life that she would have given them. Megan Huntsman is currently imprisoned at Utah State Correctional Facility, but she isn't the only mother to blame her heinous acts on alcohol and drug abuse, as Susan Eubanks fatally shot her 4 sons, ages 4 to 14, execution style outside her San Marcos, California home in 1997, after a night of drinking and taking drugs. She was arguing with her boyfriend at the time, and it is theorized that she shot her children in a spontaneous rage. She would later wound herself with a gunshot to her abdomen in an attempt to frame somebody else for the murders. She was going through a divorce at the time, and the prosecutors said she killed the children to get back at the man who had broken her heart. In a note to her estranged husband, she wrote, "You betrayed me. I've lost everybody I've loved. Now it's time for you to do the same." She was convicted of capital murder in 1999 and remains on death row, a similar fate which met Dora Buenrostro after she fatally stabbed her 3 children in the neck in 1994. She was accused of planning the killings to frame her ex-husband in a very similar situation to Susan Eubanks, although there was clearly something lying under the surface, as this is obviously not the normal behaviour of a mother. She was nevertheless convicted of capital murder and also remains on death row to this day. But unlike these women who tried to blame the murders on the children's fathers, Jeanette Michelle Hawes chose a very different route by blaming her actions on a demon. At the time of the murders, Jeanette had locked her 3-year-old daughter and 1-year-old son in a gas station restroom in 2007, and then proceeded to stab them both to death. She was described at her trial as suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, as she believed her children were possessed by demons. Hawes was found not guilty by reason of insanity in 2009, and sent to a state mental hospital where she still resides to this day. And this is not too surprising, as paranoid schizophrenia seems to be a common theme when it comes to these matters, as in 2001, Andrea Yates also confessed to murdering her own children under very similar circumstances. However, she chose to drown her 5 children, ages 6 months to 7 years, in the bathtub of her Houston, Texas home, one by one. She had a history of depression, postpartum psychosis, schizophrenia, and multiple suicide attempts, but due to her diagnosis, she was ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity in 2006. After her initial arrest, she told a jail psychiatrist, "My children were not righteous. I let them stumble. They were doomed to perish in the fires of hell." And so, drowning them was her way of putting out the fire that was raging inside them. A horrendous way to die, which was a method also used by Susan Smith, who confessed to drowning her children in the car by rolling it into a lake. In 1994, Susan had told police that a man had stolen her car and abducted her 2 sons, ages 3 and 14 months, in South Carolina. It wasn't until later that the truth finally came out, and her motive was soon clear. Evidence showed that she was having an affair with her boss's son, but once things started to get serious, he broke things off. He explained that he wasn't interested in being a father, and as Susan had kids, their relationship would never be able to progress. So this act was not only brutal and callous, but also one of the most selfish motives I have ever heard. Rightfully so, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The same fate that met Frances Newton, a Texas native who fatally shot her husband, 7-year-old son, and 21-month-old daughter in 1987. She chose to blame their deaths on a drug dealer, but police soon found out that she had taken life insurance policies out on both her husband and daughter, which was established as the motive. Newton was convicted in 1988, but unlike Susan Smith, she was eventually executed in 2005 in her home state of Texas. So, as I'm sure you're aware, Texas is well known for some of the world's most brutal crimes, and this is certainly the same case when it comes to mothers taking the lives of their own children. As another Texan mother, 34-year-old Dina Schlosser, also killed her 11-month-old daughter in 2004, cutting off her arms with a knife, while listening to gospel music in her home in Plano, Texas. She had a history of bipolar disorder, depression, and postpartum psychosis, and when police found her, she was covered with blood, holding the knife, singing hymns and chanting, "Thank you, Lord." Luckily, her 2 other daughters were not harmed, but nonetheless, Dina was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and in a very strange coincidence, another deeply religious woman, similarly named Deanna, struck her sons, ages 8, 6 and 14 months, in the head with a large rock at her Texas home in 2003, instantly killing them. She too suffered from psychotic delusions, and in this particular case, there were surviving children once again, with the youngest child just about holding onto its life. A psychiatrist later testified at Deanna's trial that she believed she had to kill her children as a test of faith, and so she was also found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a state mental hospital. However, unlike her counterpart, Dina Schlosser, Deanna was eventually released in 2012, a fate which I can only hope doesn't meet possibly the most twisted murderous mother of all, Shemaya Hall. Now, unlike the other cases where mental disorders or mind-altering substance abuse played a large role in their motives, it would seem that Shemaya Hall's only intention in murdering 3 of her own children was to regain control over her family. A sick way of saying, if she can't have her kids, no one can. After just 6 years of serving his 13-year sentence, Oscar Pistorius, the infamous ex-Paralympian who fatally shot his girlfriend back in 2013, has been denied early release from prison. 10 years ago, this story was an international sensation due to the controversy that surrounded the ex-athlete's very contentious alibi. But was he guilty? Did he truly know what he was doing when he pulled the trigger that night? Or was this a simple mistake, which unfortunately took the life of an innocent person? Well, before we answer these questions, let's first recap what actually happened on that fateful day. In the early hours of February 14th, 2013, Oscar Pistorius is suddenly woken up to what he believed to be the sound of an intruder in his home. He quickly gets out of bed and grabs his gun, which he kept nearby for protection. He then walks to the entrance of his bedroom, which was located in a separate wing of the house. Pistorius later claims that he shouted a warning to the intruder, telling them to leave his home. However, there was no response. He then fired 4 shots through the closed bathroom door, which he believed was the location of the intruder. But once he realizes that his girlfriend, Reva Steenkamp, was not in bed with him, he becomes fearful that she may have been the source of the sound. Oscar then went to open the door, only to find that it was locked. He used a cricket bat to break down the door, and this is when he finds Reva inside, unresponsive and fatally wounded. He attempts to revive her, but Reva was later declared dead at the scene. Following the shooting, Pistorius is arrested and charged with murder. He immediately claims that he had mistaken his girlfriend for an intruder and had acted in self-defense, but the prosecution argued that he had intentionally shot her after an argument. The case went to trial, and after a lengthy legal process, Pistorius was found guilty of culpable homicide, a verdict closely related to manslaughter, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. However, this sentence was later increased to 13 years and 5 months, as the charges were upgraded to murder. Now, before we go into the evidence, I feel it's necessary to quickly explain that burglary and property crime are very common in South Africa, particularly in urban areas. According to the South African Police Service, their 2013 annual crime report showed that there were over 245,000 reported cases of residential burglary in South Africa that year. which represents a relatively high number of burglaries during the time of the incident. I actually made a video a few weeks back on some of the other heinous crimes that have occurred in South Africa in recent years, a number of which were related to burglary. So I'll leave a link towards the end of the video if you'd like to check that out. But from my research, it would appear that these crimes are usually a result of poverty, inequality, or unemployment, as they seem to create a sense of resentment and frustration among those who feel left behind by the system. So with this in mind, I feel it's only fair to start with the defense of Oscar Pistorius. So, one of the main questions asked in this case was, why was he so quick to pull the trigger? Well, although it may seem obvious to us, many people, including myself, have never been in a situation where there has been a potential intruder in our home, so it's quite difficult to comment. Also, as previously explained, South Africa is certainly no stranger to fatal burglaries, so it's not out of the question that this could have been an intruder in Oscar's house that night. And to further back this point, Oscar has a documented history of being anxious and fearful, which again supports the argument that he genuinely believed his life was in danger. In addition, Oscar's defense team argued that his disability caused him to feel especially vulnerable, as he may have been seen as an easy target to potential burglars. There were also no eyewitnesses to the shooting, and Oscar's version of events could not be conclusively disproven. And due to his positive reputation as an athlete and a public figure before the shooting, many people found it difficult to believe that he would intentionally harm anyone he loved. But these points alone do not guarantee his innocence, as there are several arguments you could make to prove otherwise. Prosecutors argued that Pistorius had a history of recklessness with firearms, including an incident in which he fired a gun in a crowded restaurant. This history could suggest that he had a disregard for gun safety, and that his actions were not consistent with someone acting in self-defense. Also, some witnesses testified that they heard arguing and screaming coming from Oscar's home before the shots were fired, which could suggest that there was an argument going on between Pistorius and Steenkamp before the shooting took place. The prosecution also argued that Oscar's actions after the shooting, including the fact that he did not immediately call for help and that he tampered with the crime scene, were consistent with someone who had malice intentions. Oscar's relationship with Reva was troubled, and there was evidence of previous arguments and incidents of violence between them. Again, this could suggest that Pistorius did in fact have a motive for intentionally taking her life. The prosecution also pointed out inconsistencies in Oscar's account of the events leading up to the shooting, which could suggest that he was lying about mistaking Reva for an intruder, as he simply couldn't keep his story straight. The judge even stated that Oscar was not a credible witness and that his testimony was contradictory and exaggerated in several aspects. Now, regardless of opinion, Oscar Pistorius should be eligible for early release just like anybody else, as the law dictates that we must give people a chance to redeem themselves. However, in this case, did Oscar deserve to have his request for early release rejected? Well, looking at the facts of the latest trial, Pistorius was not granted early release from prison because he had not yet served the minimum required sentence for his crime. When he was initially sentenced, the South African law at the time allowed for offenders to be considered for parole after serving 1/6 of their sentence, provided that they met certain criteria and that the parole board approved their release. However, as we previously discussed, Pistorius later had his charges upgraded after an appeal, and his sentence was increased to 13 years and 5 months in prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 6 years of his sentence. Also, Pistorius did not qualify for any other forms of early release, such as day parole or medical parole, because he did not meet the eligibility criteria for these programs. Day parole is typically only granted to offenders who are deemed to pose a low risk of reoffending, and who are able to reintegrate into society under close supervision. Medical parole is granted to offenders who are terminally ill or severely disabled, and who are unable to continue serving their sentence in prison. So, ultimately in this case, the parole board determined that as he was not eligible for any early release programs, and that he had also not yet served the minimum required sentence for his crime, they were given no other option but to deny his parole on this occasion. But what do you think about his recent denial of early release? It's difficult to definitively say given all of the evidence available. But in my opinion, the clear answer is that he is guilty and therefore should remain behind bars for the remainder of his sentence. But the question that still plays on the minds of those who followed this story is whether or not this was in fact a planned attack, or a simple moment of insanity brought on by medication or mental health issues. Perhaps it was, but that still doesn't take away what he did, and you could argue that crimes such as this should be punished regardless of intention. Are you a stalker? Well, a stalker is defined as a person who repeatedly engages in unwanted or obsessive behaviours towards another person. Stalking behaviour has recently been identified in 94% of fatal crime cases. This means that if you do encounter someone with stalking tendencies, you have every right to be concerned. However, with cyberstalking becoming an increasingly prolific problem in today's society, with the majority of stalking cases starting with an online obsession, is it time we update the laws to protect potential victims? You may think a quick scroll through your crush's Instagram page is harmless, and most of the time I'm sure it is. But at what point does a quick browse turn into an unhealthy obsession? Well, before we answer that question, we first need to be able to identify the different types of stalking, and how a seemingly innocent fascination can suddenly turn deadly. Now, some stalkers have been rejected by a person they wanted a relationship with. This stalker may be looking for a way to salvage their relationship or want to remain as close to the victim as much as possible. Or in other instances, they're just angry and want revenge for being rejected. A key example of this was in 1968, where a woman named Tatiana Tarasov developed a friendship with Prosenjit Poddar, an Indian student who was studying at Berkeley at the time. They shared a friendly kiss at a New Year's Eve party, which gave Prosenjit the false impression that Tatiana was romantically interested in him. However, she soon clarified that she did not want a relationship, and this rejection would soon prove too much for Prosenjit, as he would, in fact, develop an unhealthy obsession with Tatiana. Prosenjit secretly recorded their conversations and openly expressed his desire to hurt Tatiana during therapy sessions with his psychologist. His doctor believed that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia and informed the campus police. However, after interviewing him, the police concluded that he was not a threat and released him. A few days later, he tragically took Tatiana's life. Now, this is obviously a case where mental illness played a huge role, and this also seems to be a common theme with predatory stalkers, who often have deviant sexual fantasies towards their victims. This type of stalker is typically male, and their victims are usually strangers who the stalker has a sexual interest in. It can start with voyeurism, which eventually becomes a precursor to something much worse. In 1999, Colette Dwyer had been stalked and harassed by a man she believed to be a predator, but could not get the police to take her seriously. She lived in St. Francisville, Louisiana, and became acquainted with Derek Todd Lee, a customer who frequently hung around her workplace. Lee soon developed an obsession with Dwyer, and he was certainly not shy on displaying advances towards Colette. On one particular day, Lee forced his way into Dwyer's apartment, claiming that he wanted to love and take care of her. He offered to take her on a date, but Colette refused his offer, a decision which may have saved her life. Lee was later charged with stalking and received probation, but soon went to prison for another unrelated crime. 2 years later, however, Lee was released and immediately started stalking Colette Dwyer again. It wasn't long before she then heard a rumour about Derek Todd Lee, that he was in fact responsible for a predatory crime against a Baton Rouge woman named Charlotte Murray Pace. Colette notified the police again, who investigated Lee but didn't bother to take his DNA, because they were convinced the perpetrator was somebody of a different race. Dwyer again contacted police after she heard about a woman named Pam Kinnemore, whose life was cruelly taken. But they still didn't believe that Lee was responsible. And it wasn't until May 2003 that Lee was finally questioned for the assault of another woman and had his DNA taken. This DNA wound up linking him to a total of 7 women, and he was sentenced to death for his crimes. Luckily, Colette Dwyer survived the ordeal, but the heartbreaking moral of this case is that if the police had taken her statements more seriously, they could have saved the lives of many more women. Another type of stalker which deserves its own category is the incompetent or mentally disabled. These kinds of stalkers are typically unable to maintain relationships. They're usually lonely and target strangers or casual acquaintances. They assume they can convince the object of their desire to start dating them, and can often seem blind or indifferent to the suffering they inflict on their victims. This was precisely the case in one of the most tragic celebrity stalking cases of all time, involving the 21-year-old actress Rebecca Schaeffer. In 1989, Schaeffer was best known for her role on the sitcom My Sister Sam. Her film career was only just taking off, and she was actually auditioning for a role in The Godfather Part 3. She had also drawn the attention of Robert John Bardo, an obsessed 19-year-old fan from Arizona, who had built a personal shrine to Schaeffer in his bedroom. He sent numerous letters to Schaeffer and even made 2 attempts to visit her on the set of My Sister Sam. However, Bardo became horribly disappointed when he watched Schaeffer perform a scene in one of her films, and decided she needed to be punished. He obtained Schaeffer's home address through a private investigator and set forth to LA. On the morning of July 18th, Bardo visited Schaeffer's apartment and buzzed her door. When Bardo told Schaeffer he was her biggest fan, she politely asked him to leave, but shortly afterward, Bardo buzzed Schaeffer again, and this time when she answered, he brutally ended her life. He then returned to Arizona but was quickly arrested after tipping off his sister about what he had done. He wound up being charged and received a life sentence for his crime. Now, this man was clearly mentally ill, as something so trivial was able to trigger him into committing such a heinous act. But these predators aren't always so easy to spot. They can also hide in plain sight, sometimes in established careers with seemingly well-adjusted professional people. Well, this was the case in April 1984 when 35-year-old Richard Farley attempted to take the life of his victim. He was a veteran employee at the Electromagnetic Systems Lab Incorporated, a defense contractor in California. But when 22-year-old Laura Black was hired to work at the company, Farley instantly became obsessed with her. He constantly asked Black out and left her gifts, but she always turned him down. Over the next 4 years, Farley's obsession with Black became very unsettling. He wrote her over 200 letters and showed up at her residence so frequently that she was forced to move several times. Black finally went to ESL's Human Resources Department to complain about Farley, who was ordered to attend counselling sessions and leave Black alone for good. However, Farley's behaviour became even more threatening, and the company finally let him go in May 1986. In spite of this, however, Farley's harassment of Black did not come to an end, and she would file a temporary restraining order against him on February 8, 1988. A hearing for the matter was scheduled in court, but the day before the hearing, Farley drove his motorhome to the ESL parking lot, where he had seriously malicious intent. After taking the life of his first victim in the parking lot, Farley proceeded into the ESL building with all of his weapons and opened fire. He shot several employees before arriving at Black's office, shooting her twice. Farley then engaged the police in a 5-hour standoff before he decided to finally surrender. While Black fortunately survived, a total of 7 employees lost their lives that day, and 3 more were wounded. Farley was found guilty and currently sits on death row at San Quentin. Another common type of stalker is born when some people feel like they've been mistreated in some way. These stalkers often have some form of mental illness as well, experiencing feelings of paranoia or persecution, but they can be very self-righteous and self-pitying. Stalking the victim can be a way to get revenge for their perceived mistreatment. They feel like they have a certain amount of power over the victim as they stalk them. A Taiwanese native named Ming Sen Shui immigrated to Minnesota when he was just a child. Ming attended Alexander Ramsey High School in Roseville, which is where he developed an unhealthy obsession with his 9th grade algebra teacher, Mary Stouffer. Apparently, Mary had given him a bad grade in algebra which had blemished his otherwise perfect record, and cost him a chance for a scholarship. Well, this deadly obsession spanned 15 years, and throughout the 1970s, Ming attempted to track Mary down and relentlessly stalked her. On May 16, 1980, he took it one step further, when he kidnapped Mary as she was leaving a beauty salon. He initially drove away, but soon decided to pull over because his captive kept making noises inside the trunk. This caught the attention of a 6-year-old boy named Jason Wilkman, but when he approached the vehicle, Ming threw him into the trunk as well. He then drove to a remote area and disposed of the boy, before taking Mary back to his home. She was taken advantage of by Ming multiple times and held captive at his house for nearly 2 months, but finally on July 7th, she escaped and called for help. Shortly after this, Ming was arrested at his workplace, but to add another twist to this story, during the subsequent trial, Ming somehow managed to smuggle in a weapon into court and attacked Mary while she was testifying against him. But in the end, Ming was sentenced to 70 years in prison. Another type of stalking is the intimacy seeker. They believe that their victims will love, or at least learn to love them, and they may have a delusional belief that the victim already does. Now, although this was apparent in the following case, in a rare turn of events, this time, stalking turned deadly for the stalker themselves. In 1986, there were no stalking laws on the books, which forced 15-year-old Sandy Shaw to make an unfortunate decision that she would later regret. Sandy lived in Las Vegas and was relentlessly harassed by a 21-year-old boy named James Cotton Kelly. He would proposition her to pose for nude pictures and other sexual favours. Cotton called Sandy's house so often that her mother finally contacted the police. But since there were no stalking laws in place, there was nothing they could do. In desperation, Sandy turned to an 18-year-old friend named Troy Kell, asking him to rough Cotton up until he backed off. On September 29th of that year, Sandy, Troy, and another teenager named Billy Moret drove Cotton out into a desert to enact their plan. But to Sandy's surprise, Troy pulled out a gun and shot Cotton 6 times in the face. In the ensuing days, Sandy allegedly brought some teenage friends to see Cotton's corpse, and when one of these friends reported the body to the police, the 3 perpetrators were arrested for the crime. Even though Sandy claimed she did not know that Troy would kill Cotton, she was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. But years later, one of Sandy's friends confessed that he took the teens to view Cotton's body, and that Sandy was not present. Sandy always expressed genuine remorse about what had happened, and the State Board of Pardons and Parole eventually believed her claims, that she was just a desperate stalking victim who did not intend for any of this to happen. Sandy's life sentence was commuted and she was finally paroled in December of 2007. A fate which certainly did not meet the perpetrator in the next case. Celebrity stalkers are unique in that their main motivation is to be close to those who are very difficult to get close to. They end up stalking celebrities who they otherwise would never be able to be with in person, and delude themselves into truly believing that they may have a future with said celebrity. Now, there are countless examples of these kinds of stalkers, including the case I discussed earlier with Rebecca Schaefer. However, another case which turned deadly in 1982 was when 27-year-old Teresa Saldana's life was also taken by an obsessed fan. At the time, she had already established herself in noteworthy films such as Raging Bull and I Wanna Hold Your Hand. However, it was her performance in Defiance that drew the attention of the obsessed fan, Arthur Richard Jackson. Jackson was a 47-year-old drifter from Scotland who illegally entered the US with the sole intent of finding Saldana, taking her life and joining her in the afterlife following his execution. To locate Saldana, Jackson hired a private investigator to obtain her mother's phone number. Pretending to be a representative for director Martin Scorsese, he contacted Saldana's mother and requested her daughter's West Hollywood address. He carried out his plan. Now, returning back to my initial point at the start of this video, the rate of celebrity stalking cases such as this have been on the rise with the increasing relevance of the internet. It's led to the invention of the relatively new form of harassment known as cyberstalking, which wasn't actually criminalised until 1999. The first person to be charged under this new statute was a 50-year-old Los Angeles security guard named Gary Della Penta. 3 years beforehand, Della Penta had developed an obsessive attraction to Randy Barber, a younger woman from his church. Della Penta frequently followed and stalked Barber, who always spurned his advances. The harassment eventually became so bad that Barber convinced the church's elders to ban Della Penta from the congregation. He then decided to go online to exact sadistic revenge. During the summer of 1998, Della Penta signed up for several chat rooms and began to impersonate Barber. He left several personal ads under her name stating that she fantasized about being taken advantage of by men who showed up at her apartment. Unfortunately, he also attached Barber's address to these ads, and during one 5-month period, 6 different men would show up at her apartment, claiming they were there to fulfill her so-called fantasies. Since Barber never went online and did not even own a computer, she was absolutely horrified and turned all of these visitors away. But Della Penta had even created a fake email address under Barber's name, and whenever anyone contacted him, Della Penta would provide instructions about how to break into her apartment and bypass the security system. Thankfully, Barber found out what Della Penta was doing before she was physically harmed, and he was consequently arrested on charges of cyberstalking and sentenced to 6 years in prison. So, now we've established the different forms of stalking, would you say that you fall into any of these categories? Now, of course, the cases we discussed are on the extreme side of stalking, but in my opinion, it can be a slippery slope. If you are someone that has tendencies to get overly attached to things, or if you have any underlying mental issues that may lead to a potential obsession forming, please be honest with yourself, and more importantly, be careful, because given enough time, if these cases have taught us anything, it's that a harmless crush could very easily turn into something much more sinister. On the 31st of August in 1998, a 14-year-old schoolgirl named Natasha Ryan went missing from her home in Rockhampton, Australia, and her family wouldn't find out what happened to her until 5 years later, as in a stunning turn of events, during her own murder trial, Natasha would appear in court, alive and well. The bizarre case of Natasha Ryan. Natasha Ryan's story is one of the most remarkable cases of missing persons in Australia. Born in 1984, she grew up in Rockhampton, Queensland, a small city of 68,000 people, where most of the residents knew each other. Her father gave her the affectionate nickname Grasshopper when she was just a child, but by her teens, Ryan lived with her mother in North Rockhampton. Her parents had unfortunately divorced, and her father had remarried and moved to another Queensland city over 3 hours away. As a troubled teenager, Ryan began experimenting with drugs and developed a fondness for running away, all by the age of 14. She was also seeing a 21-year-old man named Scott Black, which added to her family's worries. On one occasion in July of 1998, Ryan ran away while out walking the family dog. Police found her later that week at an outdoor music venue in Rockhampton, where she had been staying with Black in a hotel. The police initially charged Black with abduction, which was dropped, but he was later fined for obstructing the police's investigation. However, this wasn't the last time Natasha Ryan would run away from home. In August of 1998, Ryan disappeared from her school, and her parents thought she would return soon, as she had done before. But months passed, and there was still no sign of her. As other women and girls began to go missing in the area, fears for Ryan's safety increased, and police began to suspect she may have been another victim of an Australian serial killer named Leonard Fraser, who was suspected of abducting and killing several women in the same area around that time. It wasn't until 5 years after Natasha Ryan had disappeared, Fraser went on trial for various counts of murder, including Ryan's. But on April the 11th, 2003, a prosecutor in the case announced to a stunned courtroom that Leonard John Fraser was not guilty of the murder of Natasha Ann Ryan, and that was when the prosecutor revealed that Natasha Ryan was in fact alive and well, shocking everyone in the courtroom. On the morning of August 31st, 1998, Natasha Ryan's mother dropped her off at North Rockhampton State High School. However, Ryan disappeared at some point during that day. Due to her history of running away, the police initially believed that she would soon turn up. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks then into months, the hope of finding her alive dwindled. This was compounded by the disappearance of 3 other women aged between 19 and 39, as well as a 9-year-old girl. Eventually, the authorities confirmed that all 4 were victims of Leonard Fraser, a notorious serial killer who was operating in the area. Fraser, who was described by police psychologists as a classical psychopath, was a convicted rapist who had been released from prison in 1997. Despite being on parole, he continued to commit crimes, raping more women and eventually murdering Keira Steinhardt, a 9-year-old girl, on April 22nd, 1999. This was the crime that led to Fraser's arrest and imprisonment. The police strongly suspected that Fraser was responsible for the disappearances of all of the missing women, including Natasha Ryan. However, when he was first questioned, Fraser denied any involvement in the Ryan case. The disappearance of Natasha Ryan had a profound impact on her family and the community, who were only left to wonder what had really happened to her. The revelation of Leonard Fraser's crimes only added to the shock and horror of her case. However, in an incredible turn of events, it soon became apparent that Ryan hadn't been abducted and killed at all. In fact, she had willingly disappeared, and it was not until 2003, 5 years after her disappearance, that Ryan was found alive and well, hiding in a cupboard in her boyfriend's house. Her discovery was a shock to everyone, including her family, who had genuinely believed her to be dead. The police were stunned and embarrassed that they had not found her during their extensive searches of the area. So, why did she do it? Natasha Ryan's disappearance left her family devastated as they searched frantically for any signs of her whereabouts after she went missing in 1998. But little did they know that Scott Black had multiple houses, and one of these houses was where he was keeping Natasha Ryan. It turned out that their last hideout was just a few minutes away from Ryan's mother's home in North Rockhampton, which made the situation even more frustrating. Black worked as a milkman at a dairy factory, and nobody suspected that he was harbouring Natasha Ryan. He appeared to live alone, and his colleagues had no idea that he had a secret guest living with him all that time. Whenever Black received visitors, Natasha Ryan simply would hide in the bedroom cupboard until they were gone. Most of the time though, she was able to move freely around the house with the curtains drawn, making sure that nobody could see her. During the 5 years that Ryan was missing, She seemed content to live a solitary life in the darkness of her hiding places. She cooked, read, sewed, and surfed the internet, venturing outside only a handful of times to move to different houses or to go to a local beach at night. It was as though she had created her own little world. However, as Leonard Fraser's trial approached in 2003, it seems that Ryan began to feel the weight of her secret life. She contacted a children's counselling service helpline, using the name Sally, and told a counsellor that she was a runaway living with her boyfriend, and that a man was about to go on trial for her murder. The counsellor relayed the message anonymously to the police, but they were unable to trace the call. Shortly afterward, the Rockhampton police received an anonymous letter with a phone number enclosed, claiming that Ryan was in fact alive. On April 10, 2003, police officers forced entry into a house on Mills Avenue in North Rockhampton and found Natasha Ryan hiding in the bedroom cupboard. After almost 5 years living in the shadows, she emerged ghostly pale, having had no exposure to sunlight during her time in hiding. According to CBS News, the dramatic revelation of Natasha Ryan's survival came on the 12th day of Leonard Fraser's trial for the murders of 4 women, including Natasha Ryan. When the prosecutor received a phone call from the police informing him of Natasha's discovery, he rushed through the courtroom to inform her father, Robert Ryan, who was present at the trial. Robert, initially assuming the news meant that his daughter's body had been found, was left reeling with emotion when he finally learned the truth. He was instructed to call the police station to confirm that it was indeed his daughter who had been found. In an effort to ensure he wasn't dealing with an imposter, Robert asked the woman on the other end of the line for the nickname he had given his daughter when she was a child. To his relief, Ryan's voice soon came on the line, and she identified herself by the nickname her father had given her, Grasshopper. She told him, "Dad, it's me, Grasshopper, and I love you, and I'm sorry." However, Ryan's reunion with her mother, Jenny Ryan, was much more complicated. Jenny was understandably furious that her daughter had led her to believe she was dead for all of those years, while living less than a mile away. She was quoted as saying, "I hated her. I could have grabbed her and just shook the hell out of her. But when I eventually saw her, I forgot all about that." The public was equally stunned when Natasha Ryan appeared in court at her own murder trial, effectively coming back from the dead. She then testified that she had not, in fact, been murdered by Fraser. The aftermath of Natasha Ryan's return. When the news broke that Natasha Ryan was alive, many were overjoyed that she had been found safe and well, after years of being presumed dead. However, for others, the revelation was met with anger and confusion as they struggled to understand how Ryan could have allowed her loved ones to believe she had been murdered. The emotional toll of the situation was immense, as her family had suffered for years, believing they had lost a daughter and sister forever. In 2005, it was reported that Ryan's boyfriend at the time, Scott Black, had received a prison sentence for perjury after lying to the police about Natasha's whereabouts. Black had gone to great lengths to hide Ryan, and his false testimony had led investigators down the wrong path. Meanwhile, Natasha Ryan herself was also found guilty of creating a false police investigation, leading to a $4,000 fine and $16,000 towards investigation costs. The legal consequences of their actions showed just how serious the situation was. But despite the controversy, Natasha Ryan was not without her supporters. She actually signed with a publicist and began to profit off of the publicity surrounding her story. In 2008, she and Black got married and sold the story to a magazine for $200,000. They also sold the rights to their story to the Australian version of 60 Minutes for an additional $120,000. With the newfound wealth, Ryan was able to make up for the years of lost income and provide for her family. But the question still remained. Why did Ryan stay in hiding for all of those years? When police asked her this question after her discovery, she responded by saying that the lie had become too big. It's a rather cryptic answer, and it's unclear exactly what she meant by it. Perhaps she was afraid of the consequences of coming forward, or maybe she was simply overwhelmed by the situation and didn't know how to get out of it. In any case, the story of Natasha Ryan is a fascinating and complex one, with many layers of emotion, deception, and betrayal. While some may never fully forgive her for what she did, others have found a way to move past the pain and embrace the joy of having her back in their lives. Thank you for watching, and for more true crime content, make sure to check out the video on screen now.